Muy buenas tardes. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Mi nombre.
Hello, welcome. My name is Jenny Polan. I'm coordinating a project called Stop Arms Projects in Mexico to stop both weapons trafficking in Mexico from the Global Exchange Organization. I'd like to thank to the School of Government and Public Transformation of the Tech of Monterrey. I'd just like to say that this event, as well as being a presential event here at the facilities of Tech, is being also broadcast through Zoom as well as Rompeviento TV. This is a bilingual event, both English and Spanish. If you're listening to this in Spanish and would like to have it translated into English, there are headsets available. If you're in Zoom, there's a glove button at the bottom of the screen, and there you could choose the language.
This event is also being transmitted in both English and Spanish. And so if you speak English and not Spanish, you can get headsets for interpretation here in the room. Or if you are in Zoom, you can choose the globe at the bottom and choose which language you wish to hear this in. Bueno, el año pasado.
Last year in Mexico, there were over 30 homicides. Around 70% of these homicides were carried out by firearms. As you know, firearms in Mexico, 70% of these firearms in Mexico come from the United States. The likelihood of a homicide being committed with a firearm from the United States in Mexico, it's a larger probability than that happening in the United States, and that's the gravity of the problem here in Mexico. Today you're going to listen about the dimensions of the arms trade and the impact of it in Mexico. Most of the people that are going to be here today are part of an international delegation researching firearms here in Mexico. This was organized by Global Exchange, also by the Mexican Commission for the Promotion of Human Rights, by Global Thought, the Center of Ecumenical Studies, and the Tlachinoyan Center for Human Rights. We've been here all week listening to victims and families of victims about the impacts of firearms, all kinds of arms, in Chilpancingo, in Mexico City as well. We've also spoken with Mexican authorities, with the embassies of our countries of origins. We've also spoken with the Mexican Senate, organizations of the civil society, as well as with other actors. Doing this, we try to better understand the flow of firearms to Mexico from the outside, as well as the impact of these weapons, aiming at reducing the violence, firearm-related violence in Mexico. We have an amazing panel today. I'm gonna say their names at first, and I'm gonna have a brief introduction for each one of them. Lorena Reza Garduño, Montserrat Martinez, Leticia Cebu, Charlotte Kane, Jonathan Lowy, and Paul Murray. I'll start with Lorena. and she will be talking about what firearm violence means. Florencia Garduño is from Cuernavaca, Morelos. Her brother, Juan Carlos Reza Garduño, disappeared on September 26, 2007 in Cuernavaca, Morelos. In year 2021, another one of her brothers was tortured and murdered in Tlatoyacac, Morelos. She's a member of the search party Regresando a Casa, Morelos, and she also coordinates faith and church committee in Morelos and the National Brigade of Search. Please welcome Lorena.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. My name is Lorena Reza Garduño. I come from Cuernavaca, Morelos. I'm thanking the invitation for being with you today and telling you a little bit about what life has been like since my brother Juan Carlos Reza Garduño went missing. He was disappeared from Cuernavaca in September 26, 2007. And my other brother was tortured and murdered in his house in 2021. To this date, there hasn't been any justice for either of them. I'm a part of a collective called Coming Back Home, Regresando a Casa, Morelos, in Cuernavaca, Morelos. And this is where families of disappeared people gather. When my brother went missing in 2007, he used to work as a private driver. His boss told him to go to the local mall, Galerías Cuernavaca, and he met with these people, and some people just left the car, and then they took him. They were bearing firearms. The only thing we knew it was that 6 people took him into a van, and to this date we have no word of my brother. My father started investigating what had happened with my brother, and he was threatened both by the General Attorney's Office, and they told him to stop looking because he will be delivered to us in little pieces, or that we would be threatened or killed in our house. They told us they were aware of what we were doing. For many years, we didn't look any further for my brother because we were living in a state of injustice and fear. My father apologized to my mother because he wasn't searching anymore, and he told him that in the end we were like ants. Before the government, we were just ants. They had no feelings or no care for us, and we would just be just a couple of other bodies. So for several years we stopped looking for my brother until I was invited to participate in this collective, Regresando a Casa. For many years I was afraid to participate due to the threats, but in the end I thought, 9 years ago there were other corrupt people in the government. Now there are other corrupt people, but they are not related to my brother's disappearance. They told us there were a lot of bodies in the forensic services, and that's why I started participating in this collective. And for 6 years I've been participating in the field searches and the jail searches. We've been looking in forensic offices, and I'm part of the National Brigade of Searching. In year 2001, we went to Cuernavaca, Morelos. Along the lines of work that we have in the National Brigade is the church axis, El Eje de las Iglesias, where I participate. We go to churches and we carry these inboxes of peace, and we leave this at churches where the community can anonymously inform if they have seen any bodies being buried, any bodies being left, or if there are any common pits, anonymously. And that's how many bodies have been found. When we get this information, we can ask from the attorney's office to search wherever there are, whether in the mountains or in the hills, and so we can find our loved ones. And that's why we say we're no longer looking for the guilty ones, we're looking for our loved ones. I've been doing this for 15 years, but for many people, this is a recent situation. They go to the attorney's office and they find nothing because we live in a country where justice is missing. And whenever one of our family members goes missing, so does the society and the family, because they refuse to approach us. They are afraid. They said that if people are gone missing and are killed, it's because they were up to something, and this is not true. And I don't know what else to say. Do you have any questions? My brother Gabriel, he was a field worker in Juanapatepec, Morelos. He was an agricultural worker. And one day we got a call and they told us my brother was dead. When we got to his house, he was tortured and had a shot in the head. My family decided to stop investigating because after that I received messages, threats, and I was extorted. They told me they would kill me, they would rid my children. They had all the information on us. And that's why we can't do anything further. That's why we have stopped investigating due to fear, because we're afraid of speaking up. Because if we say anything else, we will receive threats and we will not be able to carry on. Some of my peers have been killed because they are looking for their children, for their daughters, for their sons. They're looking to silence them, and so they are assassinated. That's why we say we build peace. We want to be peace. We can't go any further. Our lives have been shattered. Our families have been shattered. And we don't want anyone else to go through this. That's why we go from place to place and state to state. We also go to schools, universities, elementary schools, and we speak to young people. We try to create awareness and sensibilization among the youth, because sometimes they're a bit all over the place and they won't tell us where they go when they go out. I have 3 teenage daughters, and when I started in this, they told me I was just going through trauma. And I do go through trauma from all the injustice. And you see that red shawl over there? That's what we used in Cuernavaca every Monday when we demanded justice for the 85 bodies that were added to the common pit in Jojutla, Morelos, in the municipal graveyard, where the prosecutor's office planted this body illegally. There were 87 bodies retrieved from this place, and the official number was just 35. It was 85 bodies. And now, as of October 2022, we demanded from the attorney's office to exhumate this pit because we knew there were more bodies in there. 14 other bodies or body parts were found. And now we will go back there to this graveyard in March because we've received anonymous information that the prosecutor's office has hidden more bodies in there. They have blamed this on organized crime, and that they were members of organized crime and that they will not be claimed. But wherever they belong to, their mothers will look for them. And that's why we're organized, because I'm not only looking for my brother, we were looking for all the disappeared people in Mexico. This is over 10,000 people that have disappeared, and this number keeps increasing. In Cuernavaca, also young women go missing, and this is always done with weapons. And they bring this from the United States. This shatters us, this destroys us. Families are just shattered, and we refuse to keep on living like this.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lorena. Thank you for sharing this with us and for your fight and for searching not only for your family but also for helping out searching other people in the country who are going through the same experiences. And this gives us an idea of suffering, the suffering of only one person or one family. And when we think of 30,000 homicides or 20 enforced disappearances every day, each one of these leaves a void in the lives of others. And these voids uh, multiply. So, in order to go deeper into the analysis of this weapon issue in Mexico, we have Montserrat Martinez Telles, who is a researcher on arm control, member of the arms trade, and also with Global Soft MX. Also, she's a PhD student of public policy. Monse, please go ahead.
Gracias, buenas tardes.
Thank you.
Justo Lorena ya nos comentaba cuál es el
Lorena
contexto
told us
vivido
about
y a
the
partir de
context
ello
in
de
Mexico,
una pregunta principal
and
sobre quiénes son
we have the main
las
question, which is
agentes
who
responsables
are
de esta situación.
those
Y
responsible for this
entonces, es
situation?
por ello que se vuelve
This is why it
importante
is
como determinar
relevant
cuál es
to
la relevancia del
determine
control del flujo
what
de
the
armas en
relevance
México
of
para México,
weapon
las
control
empresas del sector
in
de
Mexico,
armas.
the companies in the weapon sector as well, who are the companies that are involved in this sector. And just a second, please.
Bueno, ahorita que resolvamos esta cuestión técnica, un poco darles nada más el contexto. Recientemente,
I would like to
para
give
las
you
personas que no
context.
sepan,
For those who do not know, Mexico,
el Estado mexicano
or the
emprendió
Mexican
una demanda,
state,
en contra de empresas de
sued
armas en Estados Unidos. La
armed
primera fue,
companies or
en el
weapon
estado de
producers in the
Massachusetts, en
states,
agosto del
especially
2021,
in
y
Massachusetts, in
para,
August 2021.
la cual, bueno, fue desestimada en octubre del
And this was
2022.
dismissed in October
Y hoy en
2022.
día se interpuso una
And
segunda,
today
para
there is a
empresas que
second
residen en el estado
lawsuit
de
for companies in the state
Entonces,
of
un poco
Arizona.
decirles que
And
el contexto de esta demanda
I would
lo
like
que
to tell you
obedece
that the
es
context of
que las
this
empresas se hagan responsables por el
i-
daño que están generando
is
ante
to
prácticas
demand
negligentes
that
de compraventa de
companies
armas de
become
fuego.
responsible or be
Es
responsible
por eso
for the
que no
damage
solamente es
of
importante como las
weapon
acciones que se emprendan desde los
trade.
estados, tomando en
It is
cuenta, y un
important
poco ya nos
that
decía Lorena,
the actions
nos dicen
taken
que no
by
vienen
the
de
different
Estados
states
Unidos, nos dicen que
take into
la
consideration
procedencia
that
es
the
crimen
origin
organizado,
of these
pero
weapons
justo
is
tenemos
not
cifras
the
de que
US,
entre
that
el 70
it
y el
is the
90% de
organized
las
crime
armas
who
aseguradas en
obtains
México,
them,
pues,
but
provienen de Estados
70% of the
Unidos.
weapons
Y
we
es
have in
ante este
Mexico
contexto que el Estado
come from the
mexicano decide
US.
emprender estas dos
And
demandas. Por
this
un
is why the
lado,
Mexican
ante
state
prácticas
decided to
negligentes
sue
que facilitan
these
el tráfico
companies
ilegal de
due
armas de
to
fuego a México. Y
irresponsible
en
practices that
segundo, ya
facilitate
está
the
relacionado
flow
directamente
or
con
the
el tema
inflow
de
of
estas
weapons
personas
into Mexico.
que son
And
prestanombres para
also
adquirir armas y que se terminan desviando, por ejemplo, al crimen
all
organizado.
people who lend their names or
Aquí un
identities in
poco,
order to
compartirles
facilitate
también
the
que
import
quizá, si bien estas
of
demandas
arms
tienen,
and weapons.
pues sí, tienen un carácter jurídico,
So
me parece que han cumplido el rol,
I
que
think
esto es parte de lo que vemos
this
en
has
los
been
testimonios.
very
Sin
important.
embargo, a partir de este tipo de mecanismos, lo que vemos es que se ha logrado
And what we see
visibilizar
is
el rol
that
que las
we
empresas
have
tienen, las empresas
made
del
the
sector
role
de
of
armas
companies
específicamente,
visible, specifically,
con el tema
specifically
de derechos
companies
humanos
in the
bajo
weapon
el
sector.
régimen de defensa criminal, que es un poco el argumento que
And
constantemente
that is the
estamos
argument that
escuchando.
we have, or the case we have. It is important to mention that there is an international regime. I'm sorry. So there is an international. There are international agreements on the trade of weapons, and this one focuses on mitigating human suffering. We also have the protocol on firearms, which is an additional instrument that relates to safety issues in order to eradicate the trafficking and illegal manufacturing of weapons. We can also mention the Inter-American Convention against the manufacturing and illegal trafficking of firearms and explosives, which is CIFTA, and another instrument I mean, I would like to say that this is not a problem that Mexico has only with the U.S., but there's also a direct relationship with other countries, specifically in the EU. So the position of the EU is also relevant. Other non-legally binding instruments, but that are important in order to have a control of firearms, in order to avoid damages to the civil society, is the action plan of the United Nations, the international instrument of, to trace back all these components, and also within the weapon trafficking there is.
Con
And what do I want? What do I want to say? Well, and all these international agreements exist because the states are the main characters in this dynamics, but the industry plays a very important role in the intermediation, in the promotion of the things they manufacture, and they are trying to trade. So what is the relationship between, or what is the role of the state? If they are the main characters, what is the relationship with the companies, with these companies who manufacture weapons? Maybe the linkage is very evident, but we do not know how to articulate this. So it is important to tell you, yes, the states decide with whom they're going to negotiate it and under which conditions. And this is very important because this allows them to identify which companies or enterprises are irresponsible. And we are talking about the illegal purchase of weapons. Of course, sometimes there are transactions, and these transactions end up in illegal activities. So the states have to be more responsible in identifying which companies are neglecting the agreement and who are overlooking who is buying and what the destination of the products is. On the one hand, we have mechanisms for accountability, and these have to be more open, more democratic, and the civil society has to be part of them as well. They have to be linked to monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. Also, the states have to be aware of the fact that they have to mitigate risk and to consider that firearms can be used for criminal activity. To conclude, I would like to tell you that we have challenges in understanding the connection between companies or the private sector, the weapon industry, and the states, and what actions the states can take in order to mitigate the risks. It is important to see how we can assess the risks in a homogeneous and objective way in order to mitigate deviations towards criminal activity linked to weapon trade. And it is also important to want to question ourselves what the safeguards are in order to avoid this deviation and this illegal activity. It is also important to bear in mind what the role of the weapon industry is in the prevention of illegal trafficking of firearms. People who were in the 185th session of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights were part of a conversation in which we addressed the private sector and its role in facilitating violence in Latin America. And we all requested the states and the governments to be held to be accountable for the import and the export and the manufacturing of firearms. So this is what I wanted to tell you, and I wanted to tell you that there are many more mechanisms, that there is a broad context, and this does not involve only the states but other actors as well. Thank you, Monse. We know that looking at the concrete human experiences, international law can seem or can come across as cold and difficult, but we know that this is about international trade of weapons, and as Montse said, the states and the international companies have a share of responsibility here. Now, Leticia Sedou is going to present. Maybe we can fix the thing with the presentation. So, Leticia has worked as a project manager in the European Network Against Weapon Trafficking, and since 2016, and this project is about the militarization of the European Union, focusing on the subsidies by the European Union to the weapon industry, the role of the weapon industry, and also the advocacy and the the lobbying that takes place in the European Union, and how this worsens the weapon situation in the world. Good morning. This is too high for me. Good afternoon. Thank you for hosting us. And well, I would like to explain that the situation of weapon trade is very different in Europe than in the US. The sale of military material is forbidden in the EU. Only governments can authorize that, and these authorizations have to happen under certain conditions, and based on the common positions of the European Union. This position is legally binding and is based on a legally binding text, and the states have to assess whether exporting weapons is something viable or not. And I think in the case of Mexico, there are three important criteria. This common document says that exports should not be accepted if there is a high risk that these weapons could be used for internal repression. This includes torture, mistreatment, enforced disappearance, and arbitrary arrests. Also, if there is a clear risk that these weapons can fuel internal conflicts. And we should also assess the risk of these weapons being deviated or ending up in the hands of criminal groups. In the case of Mexico, all these three risks are demonstrated, and the European countries continue to export firearms despite to Mexico. So, of course, the proportion of weapons that are exported from the European Union to Mexico the proportion of this is much lower than what is imported from the US. From 2006 to 2018, more than 200,000 firearms were exported from Europe to Mexico, authorized by the government. Only a few countries in Europe send weapons to Mexico, and the most important ones are Beretta from Italy and Glock from Austria. Also, Germany, Czech Republic, Belgium, Slovakia export weapons towards Mexico. And I would like to illustrate some examples, the one from Belgium and Italy, and then Charlotte will talk about the German case, which is very important here. Italy continues to be the first European weapon exporter, at least in the case of Mexico, both for short firearms and other types of firearms. And Italy is the most important arm importer after the US. These firearms have been used by the police in serious human rights violations and enforced disappearance, including the disappearance of the 43 students in Ayotzinapa. The police in Iguala had 73 guns of this origin, and we know that there are 2,700 weapons seized by the army were also Beretta from Italy. The case of Belgium is interesting because it's half the size of Mexico City, but it produces a wide range of military equipment, and what they export to Mexico is firearms and ammunition. It is estimated, based on the figures of the Belgian government, that between 2018 and 2019, the export value was 200 million euros, which is more than 2 billion pesos. And we are talking about weapons by Erstal, which is known as FN, and it is the property of the Wallonian government in Belgium. Sorry, I forgot to show the slide. Of course, I'm not going to read each one of them, but it is important to note down that these we have the 5.7, which is also from Belgium, and this is a weapon that has the capacity to pierce through safety vests. So, it is called the cop killer. Just to illustrate how powerful it is, we see that various cartels are using FN ammunitions, and even Arellano Felix was carrying a weapon manufactured by FN. Many of these weapons were used against the police. In the case of Omar Garcia, assassinated in Mexico in 2020, among the rifles we found, there were FN manufactured as well. In 2017, the person who shot the journalist Jaime Guadalupe was also carrying an FN weapon. It is important to document cases, but also identify weapons. And as John said, it is important for us to recall or remind our governments that these fire guns not only or trigger not only the death of people directly, but also indirect victims, and also in the long run suffering and economic consequences that never end. Well, I talked about 2018, but I want to talk about the recent years. Official data from European governments show a very important reduction in the issuance of license for or permits for exporting military weapons to Mexico. And this is also based on the report issued by Mexico, which gives us more information than the reports of our governments themselves. And we call also civil use or private use, whether it is for sports or for defending the household, which represents a very important proportion of official exports. However, we're talking about 5,000 weapons per year for military use or other uses. 5,000 weapons. These 5,000 weapons are not very important in number, but this shouldn't be going to Mexico, especially not for uses other than military. Most of the European brands that make it to Mexico go through the US, and this may happen through different ways, maybe legal exports, but they also, of course, enter the illegal market. And an important trend is that European companies are installing production plants in the US directly, which is the case of DCN, which is FN in America, Beretta, Glock from Austria. And these are the most important companies sending weapons. They have plants in the US, and of course they use much less strict export laws in order to send these weapons to Mexico, also in the wholesale, in the direct sale market in the U.S., and then these arms end up in Mexico. This situation is not only convenient to companies but also to our government, because they wash their hands clean of the responsibility of fulfilling their responsibilities and controlling illegal trafficking. This shows the lack of interest of our government, because they're not directly affected, and they transfer the responsibility to the Mexican state in spite of the fact that they know the capacity limits they have and also the corruption situation in order to control weapon trafficking. And in order to end, I heard that the United States, in fighting against weapon trafficking, they started considering the military industry or the weapon industry as a risk industry. And in Europe, we're moving backwards. There is a law that is being negotiated in Europe in order to exclude the military industry from the concept of corporate social responsibility. This is the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Up now, we're going to listen from Charlotte Kane. Charlotte is an expert on arms exportations from Germany, Aline Rushton. And she has been working specifically in matters of weapons exportations to Mexico. In the case of Heckler Koch, who exported weapons to Mexico, the G36, which is a widely known case. And Charlotte is here from Germany. Thank you very much.
Muy buenas tardes y disculpen que ahora desde aquí voy a dar mi presentación en inglés. So I will use the next minutes to talk about the German small arms exports to Mexico, and I want to especially focus on one example of the German small arms exports to Mexico that was and still is very striking for the German debate, and these are the export of G36 rifles of the German small arms manufacturer Heckler & Koch to Mexico. Between 2006 and 2009, the German small arms manufacturer Heckler & Koch exported more than 10,000 G36 rifles and spare parts to Mexico, and these rifles were destined to police units in different Mexican states. Due to human rights concerns, 4 states, Guerrero, Jalisco, Chiapas, and Chihuahua, were not supposed to be supplied with these weapons according to the official German export licenses. However, since 2010, journalists, human rights, and peace activists revealed that nearly half of these G36 ended up in exactly these states. And this ultimately led to the criminal conviction of former employees of Heckler & Koch due to illegal arms exports. And then since 2010, Germany has adopted a policy that mostly stops small arms exports to Mexico. When we look at the German annual reports on arms exports, we can also see that small arms export licenses to Mexico have been denied with reference to the risk of diversion and Mexico's internal situation, like with reference to the criteria of the common position Leticia just mentioned. However, there were also exemptions. For example, in 2018, Germany exported portable anti-tank weapons to Mexico, so light weapons were exported in 2018, for example. This just as a first overview. But coming back to the Heckler & Koch case, as I said, since 2010, there was this information that Mexican police in violence-afflicted states had used G36 rifles despite the exclusion of these states in the end-use agreement. In that year, the German activist Jürgen Graslin and his lawyer Holger Rothbauer, they also filed a criminal complaint. But then it took nearly 9 years for this criminal complaint to lead to the conviction of former Heckler & Koch employees. Furthermore, the court ordered Heckler & Koch to pay a fine equivalent to the entire revenue from the illegal Mexico sales, which is about 3.7 million euros. And Heckler & Koch and other parties to the proceeding then appealed the decision, and the case went to the Germany's Federal Court of Justice, which in 2021 confirmed the verdict. So Heckler & Koch has to pay these 3.7 million euros. I want to emphasize that this Heckler & Koch case is a case in which peace activists, human rights defenders, and critical journalists really created enough pressure to bring Heckler & Koch to trial. And the trial and the media coverage around it significantly increased the public awareness of these responsible experts. I would also say that it really had impact on German small arms exports policy. For example, since 2019, it's the German small arms export policy not, in principle, not to export small arms to countries that are not part of the EU or NATO or equivalent states. So it means that only in exemptions states, so-called third states, can be delivered with small arms. So I would say this trial was a success, but the trial also had weaknesses. For example, the German licensing authorities were not held responsible, and the human consequences of these illegal exports were not considered directly within the trial. The German authorities, they allowed the export of the rifles on the basis of the so-called end-use certificate. And these certificates listed only Mexican states that were considered as unproblematic by the German government. However, the process in Germany showed that instead of exercising real control, some German officials even informed Heckler & Koch which federal states to remove from the end-use certificates in order to make the export possible. So this is our critique to our German government, that this idea of excluding only a few Mexican states is a very questionable compromise which was taken. Because the case shows that this idea of limiting the end use to regionally within Mexico did not work. And given the human rights situation and given the criteria we have in Europe and in Germany for small arms exports, Mexico should not have received any German small arms at all. One case which shows that the devastating consequences of these scandalous arms transfers is the Ayotzinapa case, because the G36 rifles were also used during the attacks on the students of the Ayotzinapa school. Although, according to the official expert permits, these arms should have never been in Guerrero. But within the trial itself, these human consequences were not taken into account. However, there were protests in front of the court. There was also one family member of a victim of that night present in Germany during the court. So this really ensured that the connection between the German arms exports and their fatal consequences in Mexico would not be forgotten. To conclude, as I've said in the beginning, Germany has adopted this policy to mostly stop small arms exports to Mexico, despite these exemptions that I've also mentioned. But we are really concerned in Germany about this development. Also, Letitia mentioned already about the strategy of German arms manufacturers to internationalize their production and also to have production sites and subsidiaries in the US. One example is Sig Sauer. Sig Sauer is a company that operates internationally, and Sig Sauer isn't producing anymore in Germany. They closed their production site in Germany, but they have a production site in the US. However, this US subsidiary is owned by the German-based L&O Sig Sauer Holding, which is based in Germany. So exports that would not have been allowed from Germany can be handled via the US by Sig Sauer USA. But the profits from these questionable arms transfers still flow to the German owners. And this is why we really emphasize that there, of course, is also German responsibility in such transfers. And at the moment, we are discussing a new arms export control law in Germany. And the organization I'm working for, we are also now very pushing for it, that the German government has to address this internationalization strategy of German small arms companies, so that these companies cannot circumvent the European rules, and also that the European countries have to take their responsibility for such transfers that might enter into Mexico via the US. So this is also something I really take also from this delegation as a task for us, for our work in Germany or in Europe to have this awareness, or to make our governments aware of these problems. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Chola. Puedo agregar que
Thank you very
Sig Sauer
Thank you very much, Charlotte. If I may add that Sig Sauer, during the pandemic in April 2020, sent over 50,000 weapons to the Guardia Nacional here in Mexico. This is one of the largest arms transfers in maybe not in history, but maybe during recent times. Now we'll focus on the context of this situation in the United States with Jonathan Lowy, who is president and founder of Global Action on Gun Violence, which is a civil society organization that's been working along with the international community in order to reduce gun violence with an approach at stopping transborder traffic. He's been working on this over 25 years as a lawyer and advocating to prevent firearm violence, along with the Frady Center, and also to prevent gun violence. He's also a co-representative and co-counsel for the Mexican government in both action suits against the firearm industry, and he's also representing a class action for victims of a mass shooting in Canada. So please welcome John.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, John. So I have a short version of my speech and a longer version. The short version is 3 words. It's the guns. Now I'll go into the longer version, slightly longer. It's the U.S. guns. Yeah. What I mean by that, of course, is that the disappearances, the violence, the drug trafficking, the money the cartels get that allows them to wield power, the silencing of journalists, all of it depends on the flow of guns to the drug cartels. And these are guns that they cannot get in Mexico, and they cannot get anywhere else except through the practices of the U.S. gun industry. And importantly, these guns do not come from the United States as some sort of natural phenomenon. And they also do not come from the United States simply because there are a lot of guns in the United States. They come because of deliberate choice of gun manufacturers and gun dealers who know they are supplying the cartels, they know the disappearances, the narco trafficking, the fentanyl that flows back to kill kids in the United States and here in Mexico. They know all of this, and they choose to act recklessly and sometimes illegally in order to make more money. Now let me tell you a typical case of how these guns get from the United States into Mexico. A young man usually walks into a gun store in Texas or Arizona and says he wants to buy a dozen AK-47s and maybe 1,000 rounds of ammunition. He comes back a few days later to buy another maybe dozen assault weapons, maybe another 1,000 rounds of ammunition. And he comes back a few days later and does the same thing. The numbers may be different, but that is what happens every day in the United States. Another example, an 18-year-old comes into a gun store in the United States and says he wants to buy a .50 caliber sniper rifle, which is a gun that you cannot carry. It's too expensive, or it's too heavy. It's also too expensive for most people to buy. It's over $1,000. It can shoot down helicopters. It can shoot through armored vehicles. But this 18-year-old has the money to buy it and wants to buy it. Or maybe he wants to buy 2 or 3, which also happens sometimes. Now, any gun dealer in their right mind who cared anything about human life and the law would not consummate either of those transactions, any of them. They would turn the purchaser away and they would call the authorities and say this person is obviously a gun trafficker, and if this is a gun store along the border, they are pretty certain it's a trafficker for the cartels. It's just a matter of choice. Unfortunately, there are a number of dealers who choose money over human life, both here in Mexico and in the United States. It's a matter of choice for manufacturers, too. Manufacturers choose to supply these gun dealers because they want to profit off the cartel money. And in fact, manufacturers know who are the gun dealers who are selling the crime guns. Over 20 years ago, the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, issued reports explaining that about 90% of crime guns are sold by about 5% of gun dealers. About 1% of gun dealers sell about 60% of crime guns. It's a small number of gun dealers who are selling these crime guns. The manufacturers know who they are, and they choose to supply them. Manufacturers could say, I'm not going to allow people to buy multiple assault weapons. They could say, I'm not going to sell sniper rifles unless you have a really, really, really good reason and confirmation from the authorities that it's legit. But manufacturers choose to allow these practices that they know are supplying traffickers and supplying the cartels. And the manufacturers are even worse than that. Of course, they choose to sell assault weapons and sniper rifles to the general public in the first place because they want to make money knowing that these guns are good for nothing else than mass murder or cartel violence or something similar. Gun manufacturers even market these guns to try to attract potential mass killers. In the United States, in Mexico, Colt, for instance, makes guns with Mexican sayings on them that they know are prized by the cartels. A market that is just illegal. It's certainly illegal. And this has happened for decades, and the response of the United States Congress has been to enable all of this. In 2004, Congress let the federal assault weapon ban expire and chose not to reinitiate it. In 2005, Congress enacted the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, PLACA, which gives special protections to the gun industry that no other industry in the United States has. So it's now harder to hold them accountable in court. And by the way, that was the grounds for the trial judge to dismiss Mexico's first lawsuit against the industry. So it seems kind of hopeless, but there are things that we can do that I think can result in change. And Poe Murray, after me, will be speaking about some of them. I'm going to speak about some different ones. And that's the focus of my work at Global Action on Gun Violence. One is we must take direct legal action against the gun industry, where you don't have to rely on politicians, you just go to court and you sue them to hold them accountable and to force them to pay for the cost of causing so much harm. And you can also get judges to force them to engage in more safer, more responsible business practices. As was noted, the government of Mexico's first lawsuit was dismissed. It is now on appeal, and I'm cautiously optimistic that we will prevail. Really quickly on apparently I should have stuck to the short version of my speech, but really quickly, other things we can do. International pressure. I think countries need to speak out and make the case that what the United States is doing by facilitating the manufacturers is a major international human rights violation. And the United States should have to pay the cost for that in the international community. And we also need to incorporate messages and make the case that that the U.S. gun industry is causing great damage here, which also blows back across the border to the United States in the form of fentanyl, migration, and other issues. These strategies, I believe, have great promise to create change. We should be under no illusions about the difficulty of this task, but I do believe that we can prevail with a combination of these new strategies and the strategies that I think Poe is going to be talking about next. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, John.
Thank you very much, John. Now I will present Poe Murray, who is the co-founder and president of the National Action Alliance, which is a voluntary organization, a national voluntary organization that was formed after the tragic school shooting in Sandy Hook. This is meant to create legislative and cultural changes in order to reduce arm-related harms and deaths. She's also a leader of the campaign against assault weapons in the United States, and she has worked as an advisor to different boards of different organizations in the United States to stop gun violence. Welcome, Paul.
As John said, 10 years ago, my neighbor used an assault weapon to kill 20 children and 6 educators. But he did that after he killed his own mother while she was sleeping. The same weapons of war that are being used to kill our children in our schools and loved ones in any public spaces in the United States are being trafficked into Mexico, contributing to over 111,000 Mexicans disappearing and more Mexicans dying from gun homicides than Americans. We have been working tirelessly for over a decade to create change. But it has been an uphill battle due to members of US Congress taking money and their marching orders from the National Rifle Association, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, and other gun lobby groups. They have failed our children and our loved ones in the United States, Mexico, and beyond by refusing to pass gun control measures for nearly 30 years. Congressional inaction has created a gun violence crisis in the United States. We have 400 million civilian-owned guns and very weak gun laws. Gun deaths have increased steadily over the last 10 years. Now, every year, around 48,000 Americans are dying from gun homicides, gun suicides, and unintentional shootings. Guns are now the #1 killer of American children. Over 1 million Americans have been shot by guns since the shooting in my community. And there have been more than 84 mass shooting incidents in the United States in the first 2 months of this year. Our children are going to school fearing that they may not make it home, and they are repeatedly traumatized by the active shooting drills. Some parents are buying bulletproof backpacks for their children. The fear is justified because there have been more than 366 school shootings, and more than 338,000 US students have experienced gun violence in schools since the Columbine High School shooting in 1999. Our children deserve to go to school, graduate, go to college, get married, have children, and grow old. That is why we have worked with gun violence survivors like Manuel Oliver and his wife, Patricia, who lost their beautiful son, Joaquin, in Parkland, Florida, in a high school. We also work with many gun violence prevention organizations. We form coalitions, and we unapologetically push the president and the members of Congress to act urgently. We are advocating for a set of bold, comprehensive federal gun legislation that would dramatically reduce mass shooting incidents and all forms of gun violence in America. Since more than 70% of crime guns from Mexico are illegally trafficked from the United States, we know that passing gun control legislation in the United States will reduce gun deaths and injuries in Mexico and save your families. I was interested in traveling to Mexico with Global Exchange and this international delegation to better understand the personal impact of the illicit US gun trafficking on the Mexican families and the communities. I have been frustrated that the white extremists who love guns more than children in the United States do not recognize Mexican people as human beings that are equal. Hearing the heartbreaking stories from the mothers, fathers, wives, sisters, brothers, and journalists in Guerrero and at the Peace Summit has been very eye-opening. I learned that more Mexicans are murdered by US weapons than Americans, and over 100,000 Mexicans have disappeared. That is tragic, tragic. But majority Americans are not aware of what's happening here. And what's worse than burying your child or your loved ones due to violence is not knowing where your loved ones are, because they vanished from your lives with no warning. I also learned that Mexican journalists are being silenced, threatened, murdered, and displaced, and there is no trust in law enforcement, military, or the government due to corruption. It's clear the US weapons of war are being illegally trafficked into Mexico, and it's being used to terrorize and control the Mexican citizens and causing unimaginable suffering. While the problem appears insurmountable, the international delegation has made a commitment to bring the survivor stories and their struggles and concerns back home, to implore our government to act, and for our people in our countries to care. We have hope. Recently, the Senate finally confirmed a director to lead the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The ATF also changed the rules to regulate ghost guns. And then after the Buffalo, Uvalde, and Highland Park mass shootings in the US, 15 Senate Republicans and 14 House Republicans broke from the National Rifle Association, National Shooting Sports Foundation, and the gun industry and voted with Democrats to pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. These Republicans did not suffer politically during the midterm elections for voting for these gun safety regulations for the first time ever in like 28 years. And it is the high political ground. The fact is, gun violence prevention is and will be a major issue for our young people growing up in America. For the first time ever, gun trafficking is now a federal crime because of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And there is expanded background checks for gun purchases by young people under the age of 21, and that may help with the trafficking issue. But Bipartisan Safer Communities Act will not be enough. It's a step in the right direction, but we need to pass more gun control laws. In addition to passing assault weapons ban and other federal legislative proposals, we have called on members of Congress to stop glorifying guns by wearing AR-15 pins on the congressional floor or posting photos of themselves caressing their weapons of war in their laps, or having their children pose with assault weapons for their Christmas photos. We need a cultural shift for a more peaceful nation and a more peaceful world. So we will share your stories with President Biden, and we will urge him to do everything in his power to protect Americans and Mexican children and families from gun violence. We've called on him to do a few things already that may help. We've asked him to meet with members of Congress individually to urge them to vote for these sensible gun laws that we've been, pursuing and the majority of Americans already support. We've asked him to actually declare a national emergency around the epidemic of gun violence and establish a federal Office of Gun Violence Prevention and appoint a full-time director to streamline the federal, state, and local government's efforts to save lives. We've also asked him to pass a series of executive actions to reduce gun deaths, including fully enforcing the ban on importation of foreign-made assault weapons that do not have a sporting purpose, and instructing the Federal Trade Commission to regulate and prohibit unfair and deceptive acts of practices related to advertising or marketing guns to children. And we've also asked him to return the Assault Weapons and High-Capacity Magazine Export Licensing Authority from the Consumer Commerce Department back to the State Department. So we will continue to urge the president to stop the illicit gun trafficking into Mexico to help end the fentanyl and the displacement crisis on our border. And we will also urge the members of the Americans to contact their members of Congress to urge them to pass the gun safety policy.